differences are obviously the traditional floor and the aviary, the birds have access to their manure all the time, so it's always cycling the oocysts through them. Those birds are generally treated with a cocci vaccination when they're a day old at the hatchery.
When you raise birds in cages, the likelihood of coccidiosis infection is quite a bit less. You will get coccidial buildup. Sometimes it's very late in the growing period.
For birds that are being raised as egg layers, sometimes you see a coccidiosis outbreaks as late as 14 weeks, which is pretty old by the standards for this disease. And occasionally I even have birds that break when they start to lay. So some of the different species of coccidia take a long time to develop immunity.
We'll find that the stress of moving and starting into production will cause a number of flocks to break with coccidiosis.
And they do have access to their own manure. It's coming back, no matter how good the scraper is at the back end of the barn. There is a trace of manure coming back on the belts. The birds tend to peck away at that.
So how often do you
You can get a good percentage of that off, but as the barn is running, it's always underneath there for the birds to be exposed to. And birds are always curious.
With the parasitic vaccines, we really need to manage the process when the bird is on the farm.
In order for the eggs, the oocysts to sporulate and be infective and be able to produce that recycling, we need three things in the barn. We need oxygen, we need moisture, and we need heat, warmth. The moisture component is probably the most critical to get.
the birds are all over the place and don't encounter each other's droppings very often, they still won't be exposed to those oocysts, even if the oocysts are being perfectly taken care of temperature and humidity-wise.
So if you can have in a pullet cage some kind of substrate where the manure will hang around for a couple days so that they can have access to it, be it through a cardboard tray or some newspaper on the floor that will stay for a couple or 3 weeks, that very much helps the vaccine take hold and become effective.
On the other hand, if humidity isn't managed correctly, they could be encountering each other's droppings, but the oocysts won't sporulate and be infective and the cycling won't occur.
And just anything that will ensure that the birds have the ability to react to the vaccine. So just in general, healthy birds, well nourished and well looked after, those birds will respond much better to the vaccine.
I think if you use a live vaccine, you need to be engaged. And so that means the monitoring the barn conditions.
If you do not manage that process and get adequate recycling for at least 2 cycles, going up to 14 or 15 or 16 days, then your vaccine definitely will not be as effective.
I think that if you're that producer that's thinking about starting to use a coccidial vaccine, it might be a good idea to find a good service person and also your veterinarian to help you through those first few flocks. They can look at your management before and during the flock, and also to be patient. It takes a few flocks to see the best results and also to change the Eimeria that are growing in the barn naturally. So getting some help for the first few flocks is a good idea.
And it's very important actually if you're using a anticoccidial vaccine that you do not use any anticoccidials in the feed.
You don't want to put an anticoccidial into a feed that is being fed to a bird that's been vaccinated, because you'll literally kill the vaccine.
Because what you're trying to do when you have a vaccine for cocci is you're actually trying to produce a vaccine reaction. And you want cocci to develop, and you're actually introducing a strain that's very sensitive.
So everyone who's involved in the flock in question needs to be aware of what's going on so that the appropriate feed can be given to vaccinated birds, or vice versa, that the medicated feed can be given to non-vaccinated birds in order to control the coccidiosis.
And if you were to come along and then feed, say from day one, you put in an anticoccidial in the feed, you would prevent the bird from getting the cocci vaccine.
So it needs to be a bit of a team effort.
This is what most of Ontario has been doing for years.
There's basically three types of anticoccidials. One is synthetic chemicals.
If you use a chemical, the chemical coccidiocidal products tend to shut down all oocyst production. However, the only drawback is that with repeated use, you do get resistance developing.
The second class of anticoccidials, which is the ionophores.
And they are produced by fermentation, and the ionophores are really the mainstay of the anticoccidials.
Many of the ionophore products we have today registered in Canada have some antibacterial effect, and they also allow some oocyst cycling at the same time that they will actually prevent some of the oocysts from completing the life cycle.
They have specifically affect ion transport into the cell membranes of the protozoa, a very complex type of mode of action, and they tend to have been used for a long period of time and are less prone to resistance than some of the chemicals.
There's now a third class, and that is what I call potentiated ionophores, and those would be mixtures of an ionophore with nicarbazine.
Our goal with anticoccidial medication programs is to provide programs that offer really good protection, performance, they're cost effective, and they also maintain the life of the products themselves. We are concerned about antimicrobial resistance.
The genetic basis for resistance within the coccidia is not very complex. And in some cases, it's a single gene change, a single mutation, which can cause resistance. The only way to cope with that actually is to change to another anticoccidial.
To minimize resistance, you want to make sure you don't use them continuously. You want to be strategically placing them in potentially the right season of the year, and only using them every so often for potentially 1 or 2 flocks at a time.
It is very common in Canada to start off on day one with a coccidiostat.
We will use an anticoccidial from day 1, often up to 15 weeks of age, for floor-raised pullets. Producers will also sometimes choose, when they've got pullets that are raised in cages that have paper, where they leave the paper on the cages. That again provides contact with the cocci. Replacement pullets going to become layers in an aviary system, we would treat them very similar to floor-raised pullets in that they will come in contact with cocci in their environment. So we would treat them with an anticoccidial product during the raising phase, and long before they lay eggs, they'd be off an anticoccidial and they will have developed immunity.
There are some chemical products that do require withdrawal.
So the reason why there is a withdrawal for some of the anticoccidial medications, it's to do with the clearance of the drug from the tissues of the bird. That is Health Canada's decision as to how many days withdrawal. There will be 0 up to 4 or 5 potentially in some of these anticoccidial medications.
The local management is the absolute key to success. The one where they're in the facility several times a day, they're checking the waters, they're checking the feeders, and they're particularly checking the ventilation and making sure everything is good there. They're going to get the best results. And they're the ones that actually decisions should be made on. Now, if all those things are in place and they're not getting good results, maybe there is a reason to change anticoccidial programs. But those decisions shouldn't be made based on the problem forms.
It'll get better with time. And people need some experience. That's what they need.
There's 5 or 6 Ontario veterinarians that specialize in poultry, and taking advantage of their knowledge. I mean, that's what they do. They're professionals, and it's money well spent.